That would provoke some.
Hi, Obi, African Caribbean Company.
Hmm.
I like the point you made about the relevance of infrastructure to economic growth.
Hmm.
And my question is around China's investment in infrastructure in the African continent.
Yep.
I wanted to know what your view is on the sort of like long-term cost and benefit of that investment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. I think that I guess there's both good news and bad news and maybe not so good news in sort of involved in that. To the extent that China provides a new source of capital for developing infrastructure on the continent, I think that's great. I think the questions that remain to be seen is, does it actually happen? I read a lot about China is committed to spend, $40 billion on building new railroads in Nigeria. I've seen little evidence of any new railroads being built in Nigeria, but that could be part of my complaint about the government being unserious. Maybe it's the Chinese, I don't know. And so like sort of case after case where you see all these headline announcements and then you wait for the follow-on and you don't see much in the way of results. I think there have been controversies, particularly in some of the East African countries, about commitments by the Chinese to develop infrastructure and then wholesale imports of Chinese workers to carry out the work on sort of constructing these facilities, which I think has sort of sets of problems of its own. But for me, rather than sort of blame the Chinese, I sort of think the responsibility has to lie in the hands of the governments and the people of the continent. Okay, if Nigeria works out a deal for the Chinese to spend $40 billion on railroads, I think that's great. Now it's up to Nigeria to actually make sure that happens and to make sure that the infrastructure they build serves their needs. So I have no problems with China. Quite frankly, the U.S. seems to have no problems with China as a source of capital. So why on earth should Nigeria or Ghana or anybody else have a problem with it?
Good morning.
No, you have to let one of the ladies speak. I mean,
actually, why not?
See, this is the typical African thing on women's rights. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Apologies, I'll speak to you later. Sorry, my name is Winston Belgam. I'm of Uptonville Investment Division. We've derived a lot of inspiration from organisations like yourself in terms of seeing the types of moves that you make on the EMEA. I mean, we don't operate at anywhere near the scale you do, but just wanted to say that we actually spent a lot of time in Indonesia and Malaysia last month, not just because Bali was nearby and it was a long-term objection for me to get there. I think, what are your views on what this sort of phenomenon of, I guess, cultural arbitrage that we're seeing from an investment point of view in some of these countries where there are some excellent ideas, there's some excellent systems being put in place, not necessarily at governmental level in, say, Indonesia, Singapore, and Malaysia, but within the actual, if you scale it down and look at it from the micro level, there seems to be a lot of leadership and capacity building taking part in at the regional level.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered whether just old school concepts just like twinning, where a sort of development agency in Singapore where they sort of parachute a couple of guys into, you name it, the NDDC or RSSDA or whatever parastatal, and then vice versa. My father tells me that used to happen a lot in the, say, mid-80s, 70s, and I think that we're not a million miles away in countries like Nigeria or Ghana from actually fixing these things. There's an element of panel beating that can happen. I mean, we haven't got anywhere near your capital, but we've put best part of $500,000 to $1 million down this year, and we're sort of seeing some green shoots. And everything, obviously, things take longer, and things always cost more. But I mean, I just wondered what your thoughts were, having your sort of global perspective.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great idea. I've often, I see my brother, I've often joked and told him that, actually, how we will solve Nigeria's problem? He said, well, what is that? I said, we should outsource our government. He said, think about it. We'll tell the Singaporeans, we'll give you 10 years, you come fix our governance. Or maybe the Swiss, somebody sort of neutral that everybody likes, But on a serious note, I think, to the extent that there are things that are happening, whether it's in Indonesia or in India or Brazil or South Africa, and I think one of the things that I found sort of most gratifying is that finally we're starting to see South African businesses play the roles that they should on the African continent. For far too long, I thought South African companies were way too timid. They wouldn't invest in places like Ghana or Nigeria or Niger. I mean, Cote d'Ivoire, they had problems, so I can understand that. But I think it is a good thing when we're starting to see that kind of interregional activity. I would encourage, love to see a lot more between Nigeria and Brazil, Nigeria and India, Nigeria and China, Ghana and Indonesia. I think all of those are very good things because, quite frankly, many of the problems are very similar. Yes, they are unique sort of circumstances that adhere to each country, but the problems are similar. And there is nothing wrong with learning from the examples and the sort of the failures and successes of other countries. So I think it's a good thing. Finally, thank you.
Thank you for your presentation, which I found very interesting. My name is Isabella Ikezago, and I am an investment analyst with the International Finance Corporation, the private sector investment arm of the World Bank.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, you had said during your speech that ordinary people can effect change and cited the example of the Arab Springs.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember watching those events unfold and thinking, could this really happen in Nigeria? There were significant factors that I thought were different between the populace in North Africa and the Maghreb versus Nigeria. For instance, you're only dealing with one language, Arabic. It was a pretty educated segment of the population. They seem to have more technology infrastructure at their disposal, etc. And I was wondering, because you had mentioned in answering one of the other questions that we should just gang up and throw the PDP rascals out. And I'm thinking, what really would we have to do in order to see that? I mean, bearing in mind that we don't seem to have some of the advantages, like I mentioned, that North Africa does.
Yeah. Well, I actually don't think the circumstances are that much different. I mean, they have Twitter in Egypt, they have Twitter in Nigeria, they have cell phones in Egypt, they have cell phones. I think cell phone penetration in Nigeria is probably 60, 65, 70%, that kind of thing. I think you're already starting to see the early signs of it. I mean, the biggest difference, obviously, is every 4 years, or in some cases 5 or 6 years, depending on legal actions and governors who seem to get elected and then unelected. But every so often, we do have the opportunity to throw the rascals out, whereas the Egyptians really did not have that opportunity. But if you trace the roots of what I think, at least my understanding of what led to all of that sort of popular unrest in Egypt, it really was they were turning out large numbers of educated young people who couldn't find jobs. Well, that's starting to happen in many of these African countries, right? They've gone through school, they've gone through universities, they come out and they can't find sort of meaningful employment. I think the fact that you have elections provides some form of safety valve. And if you look at some of the state and senatorial and some of the regional elections, certainly in Nigeria, certainly look at the elections in Ghana. You look at what happened in the Ivory Coast. I mean, there is evidence that people do in fact embrace this notion of throwing the rascals out. But I think what you really need is for people to become much more energized in demanding accountability from their leaders. And if you look at Nigeria, you will see some, particularly at the state level, there seem to be some chief executives who are actually committed to doing a halfway decent, and in some cases, very decent job. And one just hopes that continues to build over time, and eventually it will penetrate to the dense fog of the federal level. As you can see, I'm not going to be receiving any national honors in Nigeria.
My name is Halim Abubakri. I work with This Young Minds.
Which bank?
This Young Minds.
Oh, This Young Minds.
Yeah. I did enjoy your presentation. I think it was well presented. I just wanted to ask from a practitioner's point of view. Before I came to the UK, I used to work with Bicotney Aviations as
You
reported.
might want to speak up so people can hear you.
Oh, okay. Before I came to the UK, I used to work with Bicotney Aviation as one of the project managers. And it's a classical case of a build, operate, and transfer in Nigeria. The news I'm hearing from Nigeria, it's not so palatable. It's a practical example of the private sector, mustering the courage to manage big infrastructure projects. According to the estimates, based on purchasing power parity, it's about $1 billion, I think, to build the airport. But now it seems, one, not sustainable. Two, there are a lot of issues, that are not right with this particular airport. So are there some transferable acumen that you developed that you could that you think could be applicable to such an airport? And also, considering the business environment of Nigeria, what do you think is the solution towards making such initiatives successful?
You say you were building an airport?
It's the MMA2 airport
Oh, the MMA2
in
airport.
Lagos
Yeah.
that was built by Courtney Aviation.
Right. Okay. Look, I mean, I think that's a good example of what's both good and bad about the government. On the one hand, you had a private sector group that took the initiative to build a new terminal. So far as I can tell, it certainly was much better than what went before. And yet you had a government that had promised them all manner of things, and then sort of promptly, at least if you believe what you read, reneged on those promises in terms of having all the airlines use those facilities. But it's an example of the point I make about it's sort of hard to believe that the government is serious. If the government is serious about encouraging private development of a terminal in Lagos Airport, then they really should live up to their obligations. And if you're looking at making investments in airports or ports, or and you see that kind of behavior, it's just not going to encourage you to be particularly interested. So I think the first decision that has to be made is, do these governments really believe that this is something they want to do? If they don't want to do it, that's fine. And then you can, we'll all keep using, MMA and, so the Abuja Airport, which was very nice when it was built, and over time will probably deteriorate like most of these infrastructure facilities on the African continent do. Or if they're serious, then they will encourage people to come in and invest capital and earn reasonable returns and provide sort of better quality service. But it's not a problem of Africa alone. I mean, in the US we have the same problem. So at least they're in good company.
Hi, good morning. My name is Faye Fawemi. I'm an accountant. I work with Hermes Fund Managers, look after BT's pension fund. My question is has to do with PPPs, public-private partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
Lately, there seems to be a very, very strong appetite on the part of government, especially in the Southwest, at least, definitely Lagos. And obviously, Lagos is sort of now like a template for the ACN in all the other, in the 5 other states they control. So there's a very, very strong appetite where government, because from the point of view of government, it's private capital coming in. We don't have to put in any money really, and it's happening a lot. Now, the cynic in me, or just slightly cynical, especially seeing what has happened in the UK in terms of PFIs, and I don't necessarily always think they're a silver bullet. They're good, but I just want to know what your thoughts are in terms of PPPs as sort of like the panacea to infrastructural development, and how we can put in the necessary checks in place to make sure that these things don't just saddle future generations with untold debt. I've looked at a lot of countries, and it seems to be that Chile is one of the countries in the world that has had success after success in terms of PPPs, and they seem to do certain things in certain ways, and you think in terms of, they put in safety measures, they make sure that the bidding is competitive. Certainly the way they handle the Chilean miners sort of left, you wonder if Nigeria would have done something similar like that. If we could, if you...
It would still be underground.
So you just wonder that if we're doing these things, what kind of measures, safety measures can we put in place to make sure that these things actually do what they're meant to do? And just like what he said about the MMA, I think, to be honest, I've seen a report into that airport, and I'd say 51% government is at fault, 49% is actually the business model.
Sure.
It's actually, I don't think it's a very, very good business model. So I think these are the things that, you know, that make it a bit worrisome with the way, if everyone starts embracing PPPs and then we don't know what happens in 10 years' time.
Sure. Look, I don't think public-private partnerships are panacea. Right? That's not going to be the solution of all of the infrastructure problems on the continent. I think it can make a reasonable contribution to success. I think the first thing is, you know, clearly the government needs to have in place the right kind of regulatory mechanisms to make sure that there is, in fact, not abuse of what is, in many of these cases, monopoly positions, right? You know, the rates that we charge at Gatwick Airport are regulated by the UK government. The rates that Heathrow, which controls, you know, the bulk of air traffic in the southeast in the UK, charges are controlled by the UK government. So I think there is something to be said for making sure that there's the right regulatory schemes in place to control pricing abuse. There need to be regulatory standards established in terms of the quality of service that has to be provided. But once you've done that, I think there is nothing that is more innovating than refreshing than the discipline of being required to earn a return on your investment, and which is what happens when you invest private capital in these airports. When I look at the businesses that we manage, what we try and do is focus on how you can make the customer experience a better one. Okay, the CEO of our airport, City Airport in London, he's fond of saying that what we sell as an airport is time. The value proposition we offer people who use City Airport is you can show up at the airport, you know, 15 to 20 minutes before your flight. You can check a bag if you want, and you will still make your flight. You try that at Heathrow and see if you will succeed. Well, so we think if we have a value proposition like that, it will encourage people to use our airport. And so all you have to be focused on is how can you improve the quality of service. And I'll give you some rather interesting examples of what we found out at the airport after we bought it. Now, City Airport is used by probably 70% of people who use it are business travelers. Business travelers usually don't check luggage, okay? Yet we found out that when we bought this airport, they were actually losing people's bags. So we sent one of our operating guys, and this is a fellow, he spent his entire life working in factories. He didn't know anything about airports. In fact, when he showed up at the airport, the CEO called me up and said, "Are you guys nuts?" I said, "What's the matter?" He said, "What are you doing sending some factory guy to an airport? He doesn't know anything about airports." And I said, "Well, think about it. Airports are logistics. They're moving people, they're moving bags, they're moving planes. This guy has forgotten more about logistics and operational efficiency than you'll ever know." And he said, "Well, I don't believe you." 6 months later, this same CEO calls me up and says, "Do you mind sending him here on a full-time basis as chief operating officer?" Anyway, so this guy decides he was going to solve the baggage problem. So he actually goes downstairs and he starts working with the baggage people, loading bags, all right? And the baggage guys were all very sort of amused by this 6'4" American in, sort of big American with white shirt and a tie, kind of carrying bags with them. And about 5 minutes after he got there, he called me up and said, "Look, I've solved the problem." I said, "Oh, really? How did you solve it?" I thought he had some sort of sophisticated solution. He said, "It's very simple." He said, "Look, we have 14 gates at the airport. And the way they load bags onto planes is they put them on baggage carts, and then they wheel them out to the planes. So what they had was 14 gates and 7 baggage carts. So they would load bags for 2 planes onto each cart, and so a bag that was supposed to go to Paris would show up in Geneva. So of course, you spend £3,000, you buy 7 more baggage carts, each gate now has its own cart, you're no longer losing bags, and by the way, it's now taking you less time to unload the bags, and so the planes can get up much faster. So sort of simple things like that is what we do. I'll end with a story about the security lines at Gatwick Airport, which is one of the things Gatwick, when we bought it, was a miserable experience. If you flew through Gatwick, it was really a terrible airport to go through. It's better. It's less miserable, but it's still a bit of a miserable experience. But over time, give us probably another 12 months, it'll become actually a very pleasant airport to go through. And so one of the things we've been tackling is the security queues. And you'll be amazed how simple things make a huge difference. So here, let me tell you some of the things we've done. One, we've created, Gatwick is mostly a leisure travelers airport. So people going on vacation, they use the airport. So we've created separate lanes for families traveling with children, right? And of course, if you're a business traveler and you're sort of being behind a mother and father and 3 kids, and the kids are running all over the place and they can't take their shoes off, and you're sort of, you're throwing daggers at them with your eyes because, they're holding you up. So we created separate lanes for families. We put more people to help the families in the lanes, and lo and behold, the business lanes are now moving much faster, right? The second thing we did was we said, look, rather than load the baggage carts, the security lanes on one side, if you actually load them on both sides, if there's one person who's struggling to take their coat off or their cell phones off, you just have somebody go on the other side, get in front of them, and then the queues sort of move faster. And then the final thing we're doing is we're actually going to get much bigger trays. So you don't now have to load 2 sets of trays to put all of your winter stuff on. You just put everything on one tray, the thing goes through, and suddenly it goes much faster. So when you get all these people who, and this is actually what we do, we have probably about 23 people who work at our company, all of whom spend their careers working in industrial plants. They're people who focus on efficiency and process and time and motion studies. And when you get these kind of people looking at these businesses, it's amazing how much difference they can make. The final change we're making at Gatwick is today the busiest single runway airport in the world. They have 50 takeoff and landings an hour. So we put 2 of our guys on the scheme, and the idea was, how do we go from 50 to 55, or maybe to 58 takeoff and landings an hour? And initially, the airport people said, nah, it can't be done. But these guys actually did some statistical work, and they discovered that the most efficient way to get planes off runways is to have a landing, and takeoff, and then landing, takeoff. So we've been working with the airport, with the air traffic control system, with the airlines to redesign that. And we already have it from 50 to 52, and we're pretty sure we'll get to 55. Now, why is it important to get an extra 5 takeoff and landings an hour? It's because during peak periods, early morning, sort of early evening, each new peak period you can get is an additional 1 million pounds of value. So by moving from 50 to 55, we now have 6 more. And of course, over the month, that generates an additional 30, 35 million pounds of value. So yes, we're doing it because we like you, our passengers, to be more efficient. But we're also doing it because we want to make money. Thank you very much.
I'd like to present to you the next speaker. He flew all the way from South Africa to be with us today. Seeing as LBS is an academic institute, we thought we need somebody who has a lot of credentials. He has a doctorate from Queen Mary, he has a PhD in econometrics, and he's also an economist. So he can give us a more cerebral view about the African economies, issues with capital flows, and also the political diaspora as well. He has extensive experience in central bank reforms, macro regulation, and I think he's a key person to bring to this conference at this stage in time. So I'd like to introduce everyone to Dr. Charles Okeahalam.
The first thing I'd say is that going to school doesn't guarantee that you have any knowledge. So, yeah, going to school proves that you passed an exam. I want to be fairly specific with what I'd like to say today, and so I would like to go through this with some care. I'll start off by thanking the London Business School, and in particular, I'd like to thank Kojo and Emeka for inviting me to this day. I think it's an important calendar in a calendar event, and I am very glad that I'm here. As often is with my luck, I've drawn the kind of post-lunch slots at which the food's digested and the effects of the food is having the maximum effect. I'll do my best to keep you awake. I have a bit to say, and unlike the Armageddon philosophy of MAD, mutual assured destruction, I believe verbal and written arguments can and should be allowed space for mutually assured coexistence. They need not be totalitarian or existential. Ladies and gentlemen, Africa is at a pivotal point in its history. Every generation is overbearing in its assessment of its own importance. Indeed, some generations have changed the world for the better. Others have unfortunately made it worse. It is my view that the rate of change in a number of spheres and the pace with which information now travels makes this era particularly more unique than others. It is also my view that the debate on globalization, for example, particularly on the way in which some parts of the world have missed the boat, causes others to contend erroneously, in my view as well, that the boat never existed. Africa must be fully harnessed to the positive winds of global change so as to reap the benefits which will accrue as a result. In my opinion, the key to this lies in the mechanics and robustness of institutions. In this brief presentation, I would like to explore what that term actually means, institutions. I believe that institutions are essential mechanisms for the enhancement of profitable and competitive markets elsewhere and in Africa. There is a famous economist by the name of Elena Ostrom, who is a 2009 Nobel laureate in economics. And her work has shown, and her work has been on institutional analysis, that a recognition of the significance of developing and maintaining appropriate polycentric mechanisms, and that's evolved mechanisms taken from central government through to municipal government and to the lowest points of government, even at local government. Such mechanisms are mechanisms of the commons, of the common good. And those are essential for economic growth and long-term sustainable development. Now, her work was influenced by the work of Ronald Coase, who in the 1930s considered the significance of transaction costs in the organization of firms. And North, who later, and Douglas North, later illustrated the significance of such transaction costs relative to production costs. In addition, and of some importance to the argument that I will put forward here, North also illustrated that the significance of property rights evolved from the Middle Ages so as to reduce uncertainty and transaction costs. Now, more recently, a pile of work has followed the public choice tradition. That's a rational choice tradition. To extend this stimulating area, and it's a new area now called the New Institutional Economic School. Now, using the principle of incentives, and we're all motivated by things, and motivated by incentives, this school of thought attempts to answer the question which Ostrom poses, which Elena Ostrom poses. And her question really is, what incentives do actors or agents and therefore people face when making decisions in the public sector or on behalf of the public good or for the public good? Now, after identifying the incentives, usually in the process is to assess how individuals will act and how this relates to the collective outcomes. So individuals take the decisions sometimes, how does it affect collective outcomes? From this has stemmed a whole series of work, and there is a famous writer, Achemeglu, who's at MIT, who's very famous now, who's with another colleague have done some work who say that the argument is that we should separate institutions and their benefits into what they do for property rights and what they do for contracting institutions. And by this they mean institutions which guarantee the ability to be sure that activities that take place are backed up within the framework of the law and are definite. But they find that property rights are probably the most significant and most important factors for long-term economic growth. Glaser, another writer, makes the argument that the pertinent and relevant distinction is on the quality of institutions, not on the constraints brought about by definitions or arguments of what part of the debate is correct. This is a view supported by Danny Roderick and others, who even argues that the significance of the impact of institutions on economic growth is even greater than that of the impact on geography, openness of an economy, and other such variables. So, if for simplicity's sake we define institutions as mechanisms which guarantee individual rights, we can then travel from that point to place where, with such mechanisms in place, markets may work more efficiently. Now, in their absence, however, business and society never function at anywhere near an optima. By guaranteeing rights, we are able to encourage the sprouting of ideas and innovation, and the expectation that commensurate returns will be attained by those who take risks and rely on institutions to ensure that their investment yield returns. In the absence of institutions, while we are able to optimize some aspects of the welfare function, including profit. Now, profit is often forgotten to be a major part of the welfare function. In the absence of institutions, while we are able to optimize some of the aspects of the welfare function then, once again, on aggregate, without it, we will be far less than optimal. The absence of appropriate institutions increases, therefore, the hurdle rate of investment, increases the cost of economic development, and makes the fight against poverty more difficult than it would otherwise be. It is for these reasons that Africans must place appropriate focus on the sanctity of institutions. We must build on and rebuild our institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, while reading a wonderful book over Christmas by the Pulitzer Prize-winning author, a book that was written about 20 years ago, by the way, but I hadn't come across it until recently. A gentleman called David Maraniss wrote a book entitled When Pride Mattered, A Life of Vincent Lombardi. Vincent Lombardi, some of you may know, was the famous American football coach of the Green Bay Packers. I came across a great phrase, and I quote, "The fallacy of the innocent past." That small phrase, the fallacy of the innocent past, got me thinking about where Africa is and what we need to do to move forward. What forms of institutional framework govern property rights and commerce in parts of sub-Saharan Africa during the Middle Ages? Because I was trying to link this to the argument made by Douglas North about the significance of evolving institutions from the Middle Ages, and the way in places like Europe, those institutions have been allowed to evolve. And how those institutions have evolved. And how does evolution affect the workings of modern day business, corporate social responsibility, ethics, and practice? What have we done correctly, and in what areas can we make improvements? More importantly, what are institutions? And also, what aren't institutions? Whose responsibility is it to protect institutions and the commons in Africa? These are large questions. Answering any one of them would require a conference on its own. Yet this does not mean we shouldn't try to put forward some basic answers. But before answering the questions, you might recall earlier, I just said that we need to build and rebuild our institutions. Well, attempts at rebuilding institutions in Africa need to be placed within the context of the fallacy of the innocent past. Pre-colonial Africa had markets, various forms of government and institutions. Some of these survived, others were abandoned or forcefully disestablished. Some of these were positive forces which supported or encouraged advancement, and some were not. The advent of colonization led to the removal, change, or amelioration of institutions. New institutions replaced old ones. The values they brought were good and bad. However, the key issue is that for the most part, the new institutions were alien. So even if they were good, they have not had the benefit of natural evolution as explained by North. Now, the end of colonization brought independence but accentuated the lacuna of the absence of institutions. The newly independent states were not able to effectively use the institutions left by the departing colonialists to achieve the objectives for which they were designed and to which, for the most part, they were used and indeed are still being used effectively to guarantee individual rights in many developed countries and economies. We now know that the void created by the absence of such institutions in Africa was subsequently filled by big men. And not big women, interestingly. The big men created novel ways for the newfound institutions to function, sometimes in collusion with the departed colonialists, sometimes alone. The excesses are legend, and the role of infamy is terrible in its beauty. Abacha, Amin, Bokassa, Mengistu, Mobutu, the list goes on. The end of the Cold War shone a light on Africa. The strategic value of some of the aforementioned big men was reassessed, and the high inflation period of the 1970s led into the monetarist 1980s, structural adjustment and fiscal restraint. As the Bretton Woods sisters designed some good and some bad economic experiments, in general, the expected responses in growth and development failed to take place. For example, privatization policy in Africa simply led to transfer of public rights to private rights and the denigration of the commons. In many instances, whether via IPOs or private placement, the transfers were ill-designed and did nothing to enhance efficiency or the support of contestable markets. A key reason for this failure was not that the policy objective itself was bad. It was that the appropriate checks and balances to enable effective implementation were absent or compromised. The appropriate institutional framework to ensure that such processes could not be compromised were absent. In the early 1990s, the end of apartheid in South Africa heralded the start of a period of reform in the entire continent. The Southern Africa region began a process of reintegration, and a number of organizations such as the Southern African Development Community, SADC, and the African Union welcomed the member with the largest economy, South Africa, into its fold. ECOWAS in West Africa and the EAC in East Africa began to operate more effectively as all regions began to play their part without the burden of strife generated by the instability in South Africa. A few wars continued, notably in the DRC, which unfortunately still continues, Angola, in Burundi, in Sudan, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and of course that atrocity in Rwanda. However, there were now a number of more effective, albeit poorly resourced mechanisms with which to address some of these challenges. At the same time, market-oriented macroeconomic reforms started. Attempts were made to reduce budget deficits, liberalize capital markets, remove price controls on agricultural products, and implement the capital and prudential guidelines of Basel I. These macroeconomic reforms have continued to the extent that some form of time-consistent macroeconomic policy and general economic policy can now be seen. Classically, for example, in South Africa, the ANC-led government did not do what everybody expected them to do, what the pundits said they were going to do. Whilst its record is not perfect on the economic front, it had the wisdom not to throw out the baby with the bathwater. It adapted a number of institutions so as to use them to enfranchise the majority of citizens. It also pursued fairly orthodox economic policy. For example, in February 2000, an explicit inflation targeting regime with a band of 3 to 6% was introduced in South Africa. This set expectations and interest rates, not just for South Africa, as it still does now, but for the Common Monetary Area, which includes Swaziland, Lesotho, and Namibia. Ladies and gentlemen, by the early 2000s, as wars ended and sound economic policy began to be implemented, African economies began to grow. A large number of companies began to explore markets beyond their borders. Africa-to-Africa internationalization began. A large number of South African firms in particular recognized the substantial latent demand in the service economy of many countries, notably in the telecoms and financial services sectors. Others pursued traditional markets in natural resource extraction. A number of these markets have continued to deepen and develop. In the financial services sector, from a geographic perspective, we now see a number of truly Pan-African franchises, notably Standard Bank and EcoBank, competing with non-African banks such as Barclays and Societe Generale. In some markets, the retail product suite has evolved with a plethora of deposit, credit, and intermediation services being delivered real-time via world-class infrastructure platforms. The telecom sector has also evolved considerably.